All right. Welcome in, everybody. We are going to get started here. Here's our Negotiation 101 workshop with Dr. Joshua Weiss. Um, he's the co-founder of the Global Negotiation Initiative. I'm just going to run through a few slides to get him introduced, and then I will pass it over. Um, as always, this meeting is being recorded. Anything is subject to public record laws, and the chat is not private. OEE has been running these Worth and Well seminars, and we are now doing a Negotiation 101, kind of wrapping up our seminars and giving a little bit of extra information to you guys. Towards the end, we'll allow some room for questions, but for now, we're going to run through our presentation. Try to keep your questions in the Q&A, and we will address them as we go. This is a Zoom webinar and will be recorded. The recording may be uploaded onto a public website for future use. And please note that the chat record is subject to these public record laws as well, so we cannot keep it anonymous. I have a short little video to show you guys, and then we will pass it over.
Your financial well-being is our priority. The State Treasurer's Office of Economic Empowerment is here with free financial education to make your tomorrow even brighter. If you live in Massachusetts, you can access no-cost resources and online training, all designed money, planning for retirement, and more. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your financial journey, and whatever your money goals may be, we have the tools you need to succeed. Get started on your path toward a healthier financial future. Visit mass.gov/treasury/empowerment to learn more.
All right, thank you, everybody. I will stop my share now. Excellent. And if you are feeling ready, Dr. Weiss, I will pass it over to you.
Great. Thank you. Let me go ahead and share this. So, oops. Can everybody see that okay? Sophie, does that look all right? Okay, great. Well, hi, everybody. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me. My name is Josh Weiss, as Sophie mentioned, and I'm going to share a little bit of some background and knowledge about negotiation. So this session is designed to really be a level set in some ways. And if you don't know a lot about negotiation, that's a great thing, because we're going to touch on what I would consider to be some of the core basic ideas. And one of the things that you're going to notice is I'm going to try to challenge you a little bit here, because for many of us, what we know about negotiation has come from a number of different sources, some legitimate, some maybe that are leading you a little astray, like perhaps the media or something along those lines. So I want to share with you my perspective on negotiation, and I hope that it will be helpful for you in beginning to rethink negotiation a little bit. I think there are a lot of conceptions about negotiation, many of which get in the way of actually being effective. And I'm going to share shortly with you a broader definition of negotiation, but I just want to say that for me, negotiation is a life skill. It's the kind of thing that we, of course, do at work, internally with our bosses and colleagues and people that work with us, as well as externally with clients, with other companies we want to work with, etc. But it's also something that we do at home with our families, our parents, our spouses, our partners, our kids for sure seem to be pretty intuitive master negotiators. And in the world around us, when we have to deal with a credit card company or if we're buying a house or a car, all of those are negotiations. And so you're really doing this every day, all the time. And that's why it's so very important to learn these skills. As Sophie mentioned, I'm going to talk for a little bit and share some of the core of this presentation. And along the way, we're going to have a few different polls for you to jump in and engage with. And I definitely want to leave some time to um, pick up on any questions that you might have. Feel free to add them to the chat. I may hold off. I'm likely going to hold off on your questions till the end, and then we can kind of take them all in a block. But as I go, feel free to drop them in and let me know what's on your mind. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. And let me just share with all of you a little bit of where we're headed here and what we're trying to accomplish. So the first thing that I'm going to actually do is talk a little bit about what is negotiation and why do people negotiate anyways? What's the purpose? What are we trying to accomplish? From there, I'm going to talk about common mistakes that negotiators make. There's a lot of them, and this is the narrative that we've learned, the story that we've learned about what effective negotiation looks like. Um, and then I want to share with you that there are really two primary styles or primary models, I should say, of negotiation and something called negotiation styles. So I want to make sure that you understand what those two models look like generally. And again, we don't have that much time today, so I'm going to touch on these. And if you do happen to join in the subsequent sessions that we have on salary negotiation and longer financial negotiation transactions, we'll pick back up on some of these things as we go. But then I'm going to finish up with, for me, what are 5 key principles of negotiation that can guide you in most of your negotiations? Now, of course, each negotiation is a little bit unique, so you have to be careful applying what you learn and what you do to every negotiation. But the things that I'm going to talk to you about are broad enough that they give you a sense of how to go about negotiation in the most helpful of ways. All right. So, Sophie, if you could pop up the first slide. So, folks, I just have a quick question for you. And the question is, what word first comes to mind when you hear the word negotiation? And I've given you a couple to think about. So go ahead and vote if you would. You got 4 choices: agreement, compromise, haggling, anxiety. And there may be others, but we only had 4 choices, so sorry about that. So I'll give you maybe 10 more seconds if I can. Looks like there's a couple more people that still need to vote if you already haven't. Okay, looks like 1 or 2 more. Don't want to leave your voice out of this, but I'll give you 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, Sophie, if you could just share, or I can share the results too. So 6 of you said agreement, 9 of you said compromise, 5 of you said haggling, and nobody said anxiety. So that's great. I'm glad that you're not feeling anxious about this. And maybe there was another word in there that you would have chosen as well that we can touch on at some point. But this is good, and I appreciate that. And I'm going to, in many ways, touch on some of these as we get going here. And as you'll see, some of these ideas get in the way just a little bit. Okay. So let's talk about what is negotiation. So as I said, I kind of take a pretty broad notion of negotiation. And so I define it as a discussion to see if some agreement makes sense to the parties involved based on their objectives. Okay, so I'll say that one more time. A discussion to see if some agreement makes sense to the parties involved based on their objectives. So, Sophie, if you could, let's put up the next poll slide, and they're coming fast and furious, but they will we'll slow that down in a minute. So if you can pop up that next slide or not next
Yep,
poll, that would be
just
awesome.
getting that going now.
Mhm.
There we go.
So for you, when you think about this, what's the purpose of negotiation in your mind? Is it to reach an agreement, to get to know the other negotiator, to meet your objective as best as possible, or to give up something very important to make progress? Okay, another 5 seconds if we could. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, let me end that and show you the results here. So about a third of you said to reach agreement, and about 67% of you, the other 2/3, basically said to meet your objective as best as possible. So that's great. And let me just kind of talk a little bit about that for 1 second. So often people think that the purpose of negotiation is to reach agreement. And let me sort of challenge that a bit by saying it's not. The purpose, as most of you sort of picked up on from this definition, is to meet your objective as best as possible. So why do I say that, and why do I make this distinction? The reason I make the distinction is actually, if you think that the purpose of negotiation is to reach agreement, it's not so hard to reach agreement. You can always say yes to whatever, right? But that means that there are a lot of negotiated agreements that are out there that aren't really so great for you. So if you think about your purpose in negotiation as meeting your objective as best as possible, it changes how you see negotiation. I have a lot of students and people in the trainings that I do who, when they go into negotiation and they see it with the purpose of reaching agreement, they reach agreement. But then I ask them, does that agreement, is that better than other possibilities that were out there? Or does this meet your objective as best as possible? Sometimes the answer is actually no, it doesn't. And this is, I gave up on something that was really valuable to me, things along those lines. So what I try to help people to understand is that reaching agreement is one outcome of a negotiation process. So if I go through a negotiation and I come to the end of it and I realize, I actually could do better elsewhere. I could do better exercising what we would call our best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or our BATNA, by walking away or things along those lines. That conclusion is actually possibly a success, right? Because I realize that it's not in my best interest to reach an agreement here. So if you just change the frame of how you look at negotiation from my goal is to reach agreement to my goal is to meet my objective as best as possible, and does reaching an agreement do that here, I've changed the way that I view negotiation. And I can't tell you how many people have said to me over the years, it's so helpful to realize that, because now I don't feel the pressure to reach agreement. A lot of times, for example, one dynamic that pushes down on people are deadlines and time pressure. And if I see myself as my goal is to reach agreement, then that deadline and time pressure pushes me often to reach an agreement that's actually not very good for me. And so resisting that can be exceedingly helpful and actually in your best interest. So think of negotiation as one really important tool for solving your problems and meeting your objectives. So that said, why is it that people negotiate? So in my mind, they really negotiate for three things, three reasons. The first is to create deals that work for them as best as possible, as we just talked about. People also negotiate to build relationships. Relationships are the lifeblood of negotiation. Relationships are the kind of thing that change negotiations from a bargaining and a haggling perspective on things to actually negotiating and understanding what's really going on and what do people really need to get out of a particular situation in order to make it really helpful for them. And the third reason that we use negotiation and negotiation skills is to resolve conflict. Now, you may not quite see it that way, but the skill set that's involved here is exactly that we use the same kind of ideas and concepts to resolve conflicts. So again, just to reiterate, the purpose of negotiation is not to reach agreement, but rather to meet your objective as best as possible. Okay? A really important distinction that I hope you're taking in. Now, there are some truisms about negotiation. A truism is simply a statement that is obviously true, okay? And let me share with you 4 of them, okay? The first one, and one that people don't always recognize, is that when you negotiate, you are always negotiating with incomplete information. I come into a process as a negotiator, and so do you. And I know certain things about what I'm trying to achieve, about the situation, about what's really important to me, things like that. And so do you. But you don't know everything I know, and I don't know everything you know. So that means that we are always a little bit uncertain. The process of negotiation is one where we're having to try to figure out what's really going on. And we use kind of the 80-20 rule, and I'll come back to this later. But basically, when you prepare for a negotiation, and you should prepare for a negotiation if you don't, we use the 80-20 rule, which means that there's about 80% of a negotiation that you know about, that you know what the important issues are, the challenges and things along those lines. And there's about 20% that you're going to come to learn as the process unfolds. So part of the challenge is that you're going to have to remain open to that fact that there's going to be new information that comes up that you weren't aware of when you started this process that you're going to have to manage. And so again, later you'll see that one of the really important skills that you can learn to be an effective negotiator is adaptability and flexibility in your mindset and your thinking. Okay. Second truism, when we think about our negotiations, and over the years, I've been working in this field for really close to 30 years now. And when I do teaching and training and ask people a certain question, I get this response. So the question that I ask folks is, how many of your negotiations are one-off, meaning that you're going to negotiate with this person once and never really see them again, versus negotiating with the same people over and over again? Typically, and there's a little bit of variation, but not a whole lot, 80 to 90% of your negotiations, whether it's in life or at work or at home, whatever it might be, are with the same people or organizations over and over again. And if that's the case, how you negotiate matters. Because if I try to take advantage of them, if I try to manipulate them, and then I need to sit down with them again 6 months later or a year later, they're going to figure some of these things out. And the relationship is going to be damaged. There isn't going to be trust. And so negotiations get harder, not easier. So for us, the challenge is, how do we meet our short-term goal, which is something we always have to do in negotiation, but also keep an eye on the long term, on the relationship, and not sacrificing the relationship in order to meet that short-term goal. Really important. And the biggest mistake I see negotiators make is that, where they'll be so focused on the short-term sale or the short-term this, that they'll do some damage to the relationship. And only later will they come to realize the kind of problem they've created for themselves. The third truism about negotiation, as I mentioned a moment ago, is that you are going to fail without preparation, but you have to prepare the right way. And I'll talk about this a little bit later. But the question of whether you need to fail or you need to prepare or not is not really a question. You have to prepare, because negotiation requires a lot of thought. It requires thinking through the different dimensions involved, what you know, what you don't. What does the other side need as part of this? So I've had people say to me, I don't have time to prepare. And so when they do tell me that, I say, well, then you're preparing to fail, because you are not going to succeed unless you invest time doing research, learning about what's important in this particular negotiation, and understanding the dynamics involved. Now, the last truism that I'm going to share with you is a tough one to get your head around, but it's true. And it is that assumptions are the silent killers of effective negotiation. Now, the reason I say that is not to say that assumptions are bad. We make assumptions all day, every day. They're really important to help us get through life. But when we make assumptions, what happens is we start to drift in terms of our understanding and our perspective on what's going on in a negotiation. When we make an assumption, the other side doesn't know we're making that assumption, and they're not making that assumption. So our understanding is moving further and further away as we make these assumptions. And when people get stuck in negotiation, and I'm often asked to help them and try to work with them, the first thing I do is I try to listen to them about what's happened and what assumptions they've made that have created the rift between them and the other negotiator. And invariably, they're there. You just have to find them. So one of the things that you want to do is constantly check your assumptions. And if the other negotiator says something and you don't understand why, you want to try to probe a little bit for what they're assuming so that you don't take away something negative when it wasn't meant that way. There's a challenge in negotiation called the intent and impact problem that we experience a lot. And what that means is that we go into a negotiation with a certain intention, but the impact on the other negotiator of what we said and did is very different than what we intended. So think about a time when, for example, you tried to be respectful to somebody and they took it as disrespect. That's an example of intent and impact. And this is where we often run into problems and challenges in negotiation, is that intent and impact issue. So constantly be looking for that, which again is rooted in the assumptions we're making about what people are telling us. Okay. So let's talk about what are some of the common mistakes that negotiators make. And these come from lots of different sources, but nonetheless, from my point of view, these are some of the biggest challenges that we have to avoid making, that are usually thought of as connected to negotiation in some way, shape, or form. So the first mistake that people make is that they believe that there has to be a winner and a loser in a negotiation, and nobody wants to lose. So again, if we remember back to the comment I just made that 80 to 90% of our negotiations are with the same people over and over again, if I win and you come out losing and you eventually figure that out, what do you think is going to happen the next time we sit down? Well, you're going to try to win, whatever that means, right? And your goal is going to become to beat me, not to meet your objective. So this winner and loser notion is a loser from the start. The reality is I need you in negotiation and you need me to say yes, or you don't get to go where you want to go. It's an inherently interdependent process. Now, there are times when you do engage in those 10% negotiations, where your goal is not about the relationship and improving the relationship. It's doing as best as possible. But those one-off negotiations are few and far between, and you have to be very careful around those. So for me, I prefer to always look at negotiations as a collaborative endeavor, and that in the end, the other negotiator is not going to say yes if they don't get something they need. And similarly, I shouldn't say yes if I don't get what's important to me either. So better to be thinking, hey, I need them to say yes. How am I going to be persuasive to them? How am I going to help them to see what I see? The second mistake is the false promise of compromise. So part of the reason why people don't like to negotiate, or they find it a little anxiety producing or whatever it might be, is that they think that in order to reach agreement, they have to give something up. They have to compromise on something that's really important to them or has value. And I'm going to tell you that compromise should be the very last stop on the train, not the first. Okay. Compromise is something that you can always do. You can always give up something if you absolutely have to. But I would prefer that you take more of a problem-solving approach to negotiation. And to do that, that means you have to take time gathering information, trying to understand what's really going on as opposed to what people are saying, and trying to find a creative solution as opposed to a compromise solution. Compromise solutions tend to be expedient, meaning we can get there quickly, but they're not always the best solutions. And it's kind of ingrained. I've worked with lots of negotiators who say, well, we should just compromise and split the difference here. And I'll say to them, well, hold on a minute. Like, I don't even know what you need right now. And you don't know what I need. So why are we rushing to a compromise? I think this is the kind of thing that we run into a lot. We hear about it a lot in the popular media about, giving something up. And maybe you'll need to do that, but there are a lot of examples where you don't. And let me just give you one really fast one. It's a bit of a trite example, but it's a classic one in the world of negotiation. So there's a famous book called Getting to Yes that was written by some of my colleagues at Harvard. And in the beginning of the book, they talk about two sisters who are arguing over an orange. And one says, I deserve it. The other says, I deserve it. They can't find a solution. So they decide ultimately to compromise and cut it down the middle, each getting half. Once they do that, one sister goes over to the trash can and peels the orange, throws away the peel, and starts eating the fruit. The other sister goes over to the trash can when the first one is done and peels the rind off the orange and throws away the fruit because she wanted to make a cake with the peel. Had they talked about why it was they wanted the orange and what they were going to do with it, etc., each of them could have gotten more, right? The first sister could have gotten all of the fruit. The second sister could have gotten all of the rind. But they compromised instead of trying to find out what was the underlying interest, the underlying reason why each sister wanted what they wanted. That's what effective negotiation looks like. Okay. So the third mistake that people make is that they see negotiation as about manipulation and deception. Their goal is to take advantage of the other negotiator, and they essentially are focused on the short term at the expense of the long term. Now, again, if you're engaged in a one-off negotiation around buying something and you'll never see that person again, sure, focus on the short term. But I would always caution you not to put your reputation on the line, because there are a lot of potential one-off negotiations that actually end up being longer term ones. So a couple of years back, my wife and I bought a house down in Rhode Island in order to rent it out. And the negotiation process ended up being, one that was a bit difficult. And we had a gap between what we wanted to pay and what the seller wanted to sell the house for. And we took some time to get creative. We were able to bridge that gap. And it turned out that the house was a little more complicated than we imagined. And so I found myself reaching out to the seller on a number of occasions, asking them about certain aspects of things. And we actually became quite good friends. And over the last couple of years that we've owned the house, he saves me a lot of time and money by answering questions and helping me when he otherwise wouldn't have if I had taken more of a manipulative or deceptive approach to my negotiation. Okay, so just be careful because it's very easy to sacrifice your reputation without you realizing it and it coming back to haunt you. The next mistake is that the strong don't negotiate. Negotiation is for the weak, and strong people only coerce others and don't persuade them. We see this a lot. It's not true. Everybody has to negotiate all the time. So I don't need to belabor that point, but I think it's important to realize that, negotiation is something that is a tool for you to utilize to get where you want to go in many of life's situations. Okay. Just two more. The next sort of mistake that people make is to think that negotiators are born, not made. So I talk to lots of people in my trainings and things along those lines, and they will say to me, I was not born to be a negotiator. I'm not good at this stuff. That's not true. Anybody can learn to be an effective negotiator. Some may be a little more adept. We might have some skills that come a little more naturally, but I've been doing this a long time, and I've seen how when people gain knowledge and skills about negotiation, they become more comfortable, they become more confident, and they become much more effective. But they invest time and energy in becoming a good negotiator. And as I like to say, becoming an effective negotiator is not a destination, it's a journey. It's something that you keep doing and you keep learning around. And I'm hoping that perhaps this session will pique your interest to want to learn more. And then finally, the last mistake that I find people making is the one that I mentioned before about the idea of sacrificing the long-term relationship for the short-term goal. You don't want to do that. The long term is what's going to make your future negotiations easier and better. So you got to find the right balance between the two. But if you drift into the notion of giving up and damaging the relationship, more often than not, you're going to end up losing. I've seen it happen time and again. Okay. Now, one of the things I want to touch on that's important before we get into the two models of negotiation and the five key principles of negotiation are this idea of the five negotiation styles. And this is kind of our last mistake of not knowing that these five negotiation styles exist. So I want you to think about this as I talk you through it, because I'm going to put up a poll slide in a minute that asks you, what do you think your primary style is? Now, let me give you a caveat, which is that we don't always use the same style in every negotiation, but we do have kind of a dominant style that we drift to. So let me explain the different styles, and then we'll see where you all land through a bit of a poll. So just to explain the matrix that you see on your screen, on the left-hand side there says the importance of the relationship. So that's how much value you place on the relationship. And on the bottom, you see the importance of outcome. Okay. So that means how much importance do you place on, for example, what's important to you and meeting your objectives and goals. So avoiders and people who take an avoiding style to negotiation, this sort of suggests that neither aspect is important. But what the avoiding style really is about for most people who take it is that they find the negotiation process very uncomfortable. They've had bad experiences and things along those lines. It hasn't gone well. So they just simply try to avoid and don't engage. We've worked with a lot of people who are like that. Much of the time, it's because they've had these bad experiences. Accommodators are that you back off your concerns for the outcome to preserve the relationship. In other words, you're willing to give up what matters to you most in a negotiation in order to preserve the relationship, in order to keep harmony. Okay. And we can see the downside with that, right? Which is that we don't ever have our needs met other than preserving the relationship. A competing style is that you're focused very much on your own interests, your own objectives, and much less so on the importance of the relationship. You don't really care about the relationship too much, although if the other side can get what they want as part of this, that's fine, as long as you get what you need. The collaborative approach is where parties attempt to maximize their outcome while preserving or enhancing the relationship. In other words, the collaborative approach is more of a problem-solving approach from what I told you previously. Okay, so the goal there is that you're focused on not only the relationship, but also on meeting your needs. And a lot of people will say, well, shouldn't we all strive for collaborating? Each one of these styles has a downside. So I work with a lot of collaborators. They're amazing problem solvers and creative thinkers, but their problem is they have a hard time making a decision. So they might generate 5, 6, 7 solutions to a negotiation problem, but they struggle to pick one, right? So that's the downside of collaboration there. And then there's compromisers. So each party is willing to give up something to find common ground. So they have that mindset of let me let go of something of importance to me in order to reach an agreement. So, Sophie, if you could put up that last poll slide here, I'd like to know which style, so of these five, which would you say is your most dominant? That as I explained them, you quickly gravitated to that one and said, yeah, that's probably me in most of my negotiations. And again, there's always exceptions, but in most of them, that's probably you. Okay, we've got just above half of the people who have voted. So take another 5, 10 seconds. That would be great. And again, remember, each style has its own pro and con to it. There's no value judgment here. It's just that that's who you are and that's where you gravitate toward. You know, as I mentioned, each style has something where you need to work on and something that's a real positive and constructive. Okay, so give you 5 more seconds. Looks like there's a couple more people who haven't voted, but if not, we're going to have you move on here or have to move on. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let me end the poll, share the results. So 2 people said compete, 1 person said avoid, 1 compromise, 6 accommodate, and 10 collaborate. Okay, great. So, one of the things that's important is to understand what is my primary style and what are those things that I do well, right? If I'm an accommodator, I understand the value of relationships and that matters. But if I'm but I also know that I need to work on being more assertive as a result of all of this, right? So it helps point to your strengths and your weaknesses. All right. So let me just briefly explain to you that there are 2 primary models of negotiation. Now, I can't go into great detail on the 2 models, but it's important that you know what these 2 models look like and when you might use which. Okay. And in essence, it's sort of playing the right game. Marth, did you have a question? Did you want to go ahead and ask? If you want to unmute, you can ask your question. Oh, in the chat. Okay. Negotiation styles I tend to avoid by simply accepting. After listening, realized I have the option and we'll go with collaborative. So you do have an option. It's going to require that you work at that though, because the reason that you avoid is because you have a certain perspective on negotiation right now. And so in order to get to collaborative, you're going to have to start seeing negotiation a little bit differently. Okay. So yeah, we'll come back to that. And if folks have other comments or questions, please don't hesitate when we get to that piece. I'm going to try to go through these next slides in the next 5 minutes or so we do have time. Okay, so the positional approach, and I say play the right game because it's really an important choice in negotiation, has to do with this idea of which model is the right one to use and when. So again, a positional negotiation approach is in a one-off kind of scenario where it is more of a high-low game where I'm going to start a little bit higher or lower, and we're going to haggle and bargain, etc. And the relationship doesn't matter. I think that's the most important thing. If you're really certain the relationship is not going to be part of the equation, then you can use the positional approach. Just be careful of not using it in a way that is manipulative, because that will come back to haunt you. When you're engaging in a negotiation that is more relational, where the relationship matters, you're going to be working with this person or this company over time, that's when you want to use more of what we would call an interest-based approach. So interest-based approach, is more of that creative problem-solving idea. It's trying to understand what are the underlying interests of the parties involved, what's really driving them, what's really important to them. Because when you figure that out, then you have a much better chance of actually problem solving and coming up with creative deals that maximize the value that could be had in a given negotiation. And value really is all about what's important to you. So in the next session, when we talk about salary negotiations, we'll go into the things that you value. Obviously, money is one of them, but there are other things that we care about when we take a job on. And so it's important to be able to focus our attention and energy there as well. So anytime you're thinking that you're going to work with a negotiator or a person over time, or with the same company over a period of time, the interest-based approach is really more favorable and will serve your purposes better. Okay. So let me just touch on the 5 key principles of negotiation and try to leave at least 10 minutes for your questions and comments. Okay. So here are the things that guide my perspective on negotiation in general. So the first thing, again, is investing in preparation. So too often what people tend to do is they want to go into negotiation with a plan. I'm going to do A, then B, then C. And as you can see, a plan is concrete, right? It's very specific. It has a specific objective. But the problem is the last 3 pieces here. Most plans have a singular course of action. I'm going to do A, then I'm going to do B, and that's going to get me to my goal, which is C. But what happens if there's a deviation from the plan? If the other person that you're negotiating with says something or does something, because remember, we don't have all the information we need at the beginning, says and does something that pulls you away from your plan. What are you going to do then? Usually you're not prepared. And so that ends up creating a problem for you. So when we have a plan, we imagine ourselves like the guy on the bike in the first scene, right? That it's going to be smooth sailing. We're going to ride along till we get to the finish line. But the reality of most of our negotiations is the second picture, where we have to go over chasms and through woods and across oceans to get where we want to go, right? And so when we prepare, another way to think about this is almost a contingency planning kind of way. So we still want to have a specific objective, but we want to have a number of different ways of getting there. So if my objective is X, then I want to say, for me, this solution would be acceptable, but also this one would be, or that one, right? So I have three different ways to get to the same end. So contingency planning is expecting that new information is going to come up. We assume there's a lack of information and that the landscape is unclear. We don't know what's going to happen, right? So this is all about our mindset. And it's very important to focus in there and realize that, again, there are going to be things that are going to happen along the way in our negotiation, and it's best to prepare for uncertainty, for recognizing those things are going to happen as part of the process. Okay. So the first thing is invest in preparation, the right kind, that contingency planning way of thinking. Okay. Second is understand how important your mindset is. So everything begins with our mindset. If I see things in terms of win-lose, I'm going to approach negotiation that way. What I would encourage you to do is see negotiation as a mutual gains exercise, as an exercise of tying things directly to relationships and understanding that the other side is going to need to get something from this process, just like you do, in order to say yes. And one really good rule that I use is try to be curious, not judgmental. So if you're curious, you ask questions, you gather information. When you're judgmental, you don't do that. You are definitive in the way you approach things and you think you know everything. And if we know anything about negotiation, it's that you can't think you know everything because you don't. All right. So your mindset really matters, and you have to train yourself to be flexible, to be adaptable, and to engage really in many ways in creative problem solving. And so when people engage in creative problem solving, which is really the next principle, what we do is we free our mind. We're open to possibilities. We're open to things that we hadn't even thought about as we go into a negotiation. And as William Plomer says, creativity is power to connect the seemingly unconnected. And that's what the best negotiators do. They're always looking for ways of solving the problem creatively, differently, etc. So if you can get yourself into a negotiation and say, okay, I know my goal here is to creatively solve the problem that exists between me and the other negotiator. And it could be, what kind of deal is that? Could be we have a conflict. It could be, that we need to build a relationship in order to negotiate more effectively. All of those things are open to you when you're thinking about negotiation as a creative problem-solving endeavor. Okay. So now just briefly, two more things. The next element here that's important is that we have to manage the emotional side of negotiation. So there are lots of people who think that you should try to keep emotions out of negotiation. You can't. That's not how negotiation works. And I realize that makes negotiation difficult, but it's how human beings work. If I'm negotiating for something and it's really important to me, and it doesn't feel like I'm getting there, or I'm being, pushed aside, or somebody may be using power, my emotions are going to begin to play a role. And the key is ultimately that we have to manage the emotional side. So that doesn't mean not have them. And it definitely doesn't mean suppress your emotions. When you suppress your emotions, you're trying to keep them out of negotiation. That's not what you want to do. You have to figure out how to bring your emotions into the process without destroying the process. So if you're frustrated, being able to say, listen, I got to tell you, I thought this process was going to go differently, was going to go better, and I'm really feeling frustrated. That way you're sharing your emotions, but you're not blowing the process up. You're letting the other know that you're disappointed, you're frustrated with what's going on, and hopefully that will be helpful to them in knowing that you're invested in the process and things along those lines. This is one of the harder parts of negotiation. There are a lot of good books out there. I'm happy to share a number of books as follow-up to all of this. But this is a place where most people make their biggest mistake, when the emotions begin to overwhelm them. And our challenge is to figure out how to do that. And one really nice little tool that we use and we teach people is called going to the balcony. And that just means that when your emotions are beginning to run a little too hot and heavy, or maybe getting in the way, it's valuable to take a break, a short break, or just step back and get a coffee and think about where you want to go with something. Just that notion of stepping back can help you to manage the here and now and not say or do something that's going to really make the process that much more difficult. All right. Last slide, and perhaps one of the most important ones that I can share with you. I mentioned the idea of positions and interests, and I shared with you the story of the two girls and the orange. Well, that's what this is about. So positions, if you think about it in terms of an iceberg, positions are what people say they want. Okay. I want this orange. Interests are why people want those things. Well, I want this orange because I love the fruit, or I want to bake a cake, right? So we begin to understand why people want those things, what their motivation is in a negotiation, what's really driving them to ask for certain things. And sometimes we call interest the silent movers of a negotiation, because it's what's happening under the surface. So you see this iceberg, right? There's the tip of the iceberg that's peeking through the surface. The rest is beneath the surface, and that's about 90%. And that's what negotiation looks like. People come into negotiation and a bunch of the things that are really important to them are underneath the surface. And your job is to figure that out, figure out what's really going on for them, and to be clear about your own interests so that things are being driven in the right way. In my mind, there are two buckets of interest. You can see them on your screen there: tangible and intangible. Tangible are things you can touch: budgets, money, land, cell phones, whatever. Intangible are the things that make us human: respect, identity, face saving, things like that. And both play a role. And when somebody is disrespected, doesn't matter how much money you throw at them, they are ultimately not going to say yes, because they've felt disrespected. And so in order to manage that, you have to go back and think about, how can I bring respect back to this process, if that's what's really going on. So this becomes a really important key of uncovering the hidden dimensions of negotiation. All right, so we have about 10 minutes left. So I wanted to make sure to leave time for questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can get a little better view here. So Sophie, are there any questions that have come up that folks wanted to ask?
I am not seeing, but if anyone has anything they would like to ask, please feel free to put it in the chat.
I realize that we covered a lot, but also want to make sure if there's something very specific to your context, or more general, either one is fine. But let's give it a minute or two and see what kind of questions, if there are any. If there aren't, that's great, I suppose. But just remember, and I'll go back to Edwidge's comment about negotiation styles. And the nice thing about negotiation styles is that that's what you've learned to this point in your life. However, you've developed that, you've learned that this is kind of what's most comfortable for you in negotiation. And you can unlearn some of that. You can certainly learn, as I said, if you are an accommodator and you really want to be more collaborative because it's frustrating, you can learn to be more assertive. It takes time and effort, but you absolutely can learn to do that. So. So why don't we give it another minute or two, see if anybody else has a question? So what are some questions you should ask organization prior to negotiating? Okay. So well, as part of your preparation, one of the things that you want to think through, I mean, again, the context is pretty important. Um, so if you're talking about negotiating internally, that's going to impact your questions. I don't know if you, Anne, if you could elaborate on that a little bit in terms of what the context is. You said asking organizations prior to negotiating. But some questions that I would consider sort of having you ask are, really more open-ended ones that I think are most helpful of trying to gather information. So, are there constraints that you all have as we go into this negotiation that I should be aware of? Or, what are some of the underlying interests that are important to you here and things along those lines? But if you want to just elaborate a little more, that would be great. So let's see, Marta, your question is the collaborative negotiation style superior to the other ones? I wouldn't necessarily say it's superior. I do think it probably gives folks the best opportunity to reach good agreements. But it really depends. I've negotiated with folks who are more collaborative, and like I said, they really struggle to make decisions. And so sometimes you can actually styles can complement each other, where, if you have somebody who's more competitive, they can help you make a decision and you can help them try to get collaborative. I would say that in general, I think the collaborative approach does give you that best chance of moving things, of not getting stuck in a, positional approach to negotiation, et cetera. And really moving more effectively into problem solving and thinking creatively and differently. I think that's the great benefit of the collaborative style, if you can get there. And Marshall said, I work with unions for quite some time, and things can get really heated, bringing in emotions, raising tensions, blocking progress, taking breaks in between is important. Absolutely. And, I've seen more and more with unions and others, that there's the collective bargaining process and a more collaborative bargaining approach. One of my students in my program works for a union, and she actually just called me last week and said that uh, they had the most successful negotiation that they've ever had between the union and the town that she works with, because they took more of a collaborative approach, and people were not seeing the other as the enemy, but people that they had to work with and to find and to really understand what those needs are that people have as part of the process. But you're right that, taking breaks, finding little ways of breaking the tension is a good thing. One of my colleagues shared a story of how during a very heated labor management situation, one of the lead negotiators got up and threw pictures of these giant fish on the table, and fish that he had caught. And people kind of looked at him like he was crazy, but the whole idea was to break the tension and get them to sort of realize that they were escalating quickly out of control, and to think differently about what they needed to do going forward. Let's see. So Martha said, how would you advise a negotiator to improve their soft skills? What skill is a must? So again, I would say, problem solving is really, really important. I would also say it's very important to empathize with the other side. Empathy is understanding. It's not sympathy, which is also incredibly important. So it's really important that you empathize with people, understand where they're coming from, what they need in a given negotiation. But you have to balance that with assertiveness. You can't be an effective negotiator if you're not asserting for your needs and the things that that you need. Because if you don't say that, if you're not sharing what's important from your own point of view, you're not going to get there. So Edward said, I'd say that the negotiation training is not so much for hourly employees, who have no say. So Edgewood, it's interesting that you raise that because that brings up the idea of power. And, in negotiation, power is different. Like if you look at the situation right now in our economic environment, there are a lot of jobs that are going unfilled. And that means that you as an employee have the ability to shop around and to try to find the best job. That takes time and energy to do that. But one of the things that I try to help people to understand is when they go into a negotiation and they see themselves as the weaker party or that they don't have much influence, they need to think a little bit harder about that because there's a reason that you're sitting at the table with the other side. It's because you're bringing some value to the table. They need you. And as I said, right now, there are a lot of jobs that are going unfilled. And that means that you have more leverage. We didn't have time to get into that or talk about it, but I would encourage you to try to think a little bit differently about that because you have more of a say than you think. I ran a nonprofit organization, and when I had good employees, they had a lot more power than they realized because I didn't want to lose them. It's hard to find good people. So don't sell yourself short in all of this. It's very important that you don't. Let's see, a couple more quick questions here. Janet said, share more about benchmark value and how to uncover the other party's walk away, no deal price point. Okay. So in general, in negotiation, so there's a concept that I didn't have a chance to get into because it's lots to talk about. I run a master's degree program that's 2 years long and we had an hour, but there is a concept called your BAT, and you can Google this when we're done. Your BATNA stands for your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And what it really means is that you always, when you're doing your preparation, you always want to ask yourself the question, if we don't reach agreement here, what is my alternative and what's my BATNA? What am I walking away to? Sometimes your BATNA is called your walk away alternative. One way to get at that is industry standards. There are a lot of websites out there, Glassdoor and others, that will give you the industry standard for a position, or if you're trying to sell something, there are some interesting websites that are out there that can help you. So one of the most important things you can do is find out in whatever you're doing, whether it's a job or you're trying to sell something of value, jewelry, a car, whatever, is find out, use information in the form of what's on the web and on the internet to find those industry standards. So you have a benchmark to base what you're asking for on different things. So I would just say that's all about the preparation and the research piece of this, that investing in time and energy into that is really important. And like I said, there's lots of information out there. You just have to take the time to do it. So, if you meet with an employer, and we'll get into this next time around salary stuff, you want to have looked at what's the industry standard for this position and where do I fall? Like, do I have more experience than the average person or less, etc. Right? So one way that you really can do this is by doing your research and homework and utilizing websites that are out there to help you to find those sort of objective benchmarks. That's the best way that I do that. And the other thing I would encourage you to do, by the way, as well, is to think about what's the other side's BATNA, right? If you don't reach agreement here, what are they walking away to? Do they not have other people who could fill a certain position? And if that's the case, that helps you, right? So, and that's going to cause you to think a little more and to try to empathize, as I mentioned, about what do I know about the other side, etc. So yeah, lots to work with here. And I hope this will be the beginning of your journey learning about negotiation. I know we need to stop now, but as I said, there's going to be a couple of follow-on sessions, if you found this one helpful, that are going to get into salary negotiation and a broader financial negotiation perspective on things. So let me just thank everybody for coming today. I really appreciate your time and effort. And Sophie, I don't know if there's anything you want to say to wrap things up, but yeah, thanks again. And the slides will be made available to everybody. So you're welcome to have those in the recording.
Yeah, Thank you guys so much for coming. We are planning on having these about once a month. There should be 3 in the series, so keep an eye on your email, and you will also get a copy of this recording as long as any materials that went along with it. So thank you all for attending and participating. This has been a very comprehensive workshop, so I hope everyone took something away today. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.